Today's show is going to explore Native American culture, and I have brought in three experts. I have Evelyn Wolfson, who is an author from Wayland, Virginia Lister, who's a third-grade teacher at Lilja School and has long been interested in Natick history, and Dorothy Young, who's a fifth-grade teacher at Memorial School and for years has been integrating the study of Native American tribes in her curriculum. First of all, we've had authors on before. We've usually had authors who wrote fiction books or who drew pictures, but you are writing very factual books. How did you come to write books about Indians?
Well, I've always been interested in nature, and particularly natural history, and I love being out of doors. And about 20 years ago, I was teaching nature courses to children at an environmental education center when the environmental movement really took hold. And I decided I didn't know enough about the environment, and I started to study it. And I discovered the best teachers were Native Americans. They lived on the land and they met all their needs out of doors, and they had no stores to buy things in. So they taught me what it was like to build comfortable houses and to live happily in New England. And I continued to do research on Native Americans, and everything I learned I share with children by putting it into books.
We know how successful these books are. We've been using them in our schools. You have one, Growing Up Indian, that is particularly useful for slightly younger children. Do you find your classes really like using that?
My children do. They get very much involved in the parts of, you know, what did the little boys do, what did the girls do, and they like to compare it to what's going on with them today.
And then there's another book that you wrote, Abkanaki to Zuni, which is a book about many different tribes. And have your students found that helpful, Dorothy?
Oh, very, very much so. And at the present time, we're studying 3 different groups of Native Americans, and it's just a storehouse of material for them.
Thank you.
And one of the best things to have as part of your curriculum is to have a visit in the classroom from Evelyn Wolfson, and she really brings it all alive for the students. So why don't we try to recreate some of that? How do you set the stage for the children when you tell them what it was like in Natick?
Well, I try to make the children close their eyes and imagine what it was like to live on the land 350 to 400 years ago, before any Europeans came, any settlers, any explorers. And when the children are all quiet and they've closed their eyes, I tell them that Natick used to be a dense forest filled with tall trees, and the trees were so big and so broad that it took many men with their arms outstretched to just go around one tree. And the trees grew so tall that the sun was blocked and it was dark in the forest. And there were these footpaths that went all the way from Natick to the coast. And trees grew all the way from Natick to the coast. And the Indians always went from Natick in the summertime, after they planted their gardens in the spring, out to the ocean. And they met all of their needs using just the materials that were on the land. And they planted gardens of corn, beans, and squash. And Natick was a wonderful place because they had the Charles River. They could plant gardens, fill up their canoes with their belongings, and paddle off to the sea and spend the summer digging for shellfish. And the homes that they built were warm and comfortable, substantial houses that had to keep them warm in a place like Natick, which is cold in the wintertime. And this is an example of a house. It is called a wigwam, sometimes a wetu, and it's made out of bent saplings. And the reason why Native Americans didn't build houses out of big, huge trees is because the toughest tool in their toolbox was made out of stone. and we had enormous trees, very big, couldn't take the trees down with stone axes. And so they took down the size they could handle, and it was little saplings about 10 inches in diameter, would come down with a stone axe. And they discovered that they could build houses by putting saplings, digging holes in the ground, setting the sapling in the ground, opposite one another, bringing them together at the top and lashing them. And they did these beautiful circles. We don't know how they did such beautiful, mathematically perfect circles or ellipses. And they put them all together with these saplings. Well, then they covered them with mats. And in Massachusetts, in Natick, we don't have very many birch trees. So they couldn't cover them with birch bark. So they had to find the next best material, which are cattails. And these cattail mats were sewed together, and they were covered, the wigwam was covered, they were put on like shingles, one layer here, all the way over like we would put shingles on a house, and then would leave the top open for smoke to come through. Then they did the same thing on the inside, and they created an air pocket, which was a nice insulation. And the houses were very warm, and they were very comfortable. And it was well suited for both the environment and for the tools that they had to use. Young children learned from their fathers and their grandfathers how to build these houses. They had to learn how to cut down trees with axes when they were very young. They had to learn how to use weapons. Boys learned from the men, and girls learned from the women.
Tell us a little bit about this bow. I know you.
Okay, well,
This is a very little one.
when boys were very young, usually an uncle, sometimes a grandfather, made them a bow and arrow. And I don't have the arrow, but this is an authentic child's bow that I found in a flea market. They made them just the right size for the child, and the child could go out and practice in the woods. And as the boy grew up, the uncle or grandfather made it larger and larger and larger until the boy had a full-size bow. But this is what he used to practice with. The little girls were done. Mothers did the same thing with the little girls. They made them dolls, and the mothers would have been making cattail mats and whatever they had left in order for the little girls to learn how to use the material, how to collect it and dry it, manipulate it. They would have made them dolls, and this is a little boy doll. And this is a little girl doll, and she's made out of cattail, he's made out of cattail. This doll has a little cornhusk skirt, and this one has a little leather skirt. Actually, it's a breechcloth. And these are two baskets made out of cattails. Just an example of how durable this material is, and cattails are still around today. Not as many as when the Indians were here, but we have a lot of cattails.
I noticed when I was driving on a trip, I just looked at the cattails and I
Yes.
thought, all the things you can make out of them. Show us about the loose cattails.
Okay.
That's a
When children were very young, they were placed in a cradle board. And the cradle board was important because it protected the child from animals, kept the child close to the mother all the time while she was working. And the baby was always safe if the baby was in a cradle board. The babies didn't wear clothes, they didn't need to wear clothes, they didn't walk around, and they didn't have Pampers. So the Indians had to figure out how to keep the baby dry, which was really very simple. 3 or 4 times a day, the mothers unlashed the babies from their cradle board, and they had this basket, not a plastic bag, but a basket filled with this wonderful down, and it's the seed head from the cattail, the brown seed head that remains all winter in the marshes. This was taken off, the top of the seed head was taken off and shredded into big, huge baskets, and it makes a wonderful fluffy down. Each brown seed has a little parachute on the end of it that takes it off all through the studio. And that down was very good insulation, but it also was very good diaper material because the parents could line the cradle board with the cattail down and take what was already wet, throw it away. It was organic, it decomposed, it became soil, new cattails grew, and it was a wonderful, environmentally safe, sound diaper system.
Were there other materials that were used in the
Yes.
same way in other parts of the country?
actually where cattails do grow in most parts of North America, but also moss was used. Moss was a very, very popular material because that expanded when it was dry, and when it got wet, it compacted and could be thrown away again. And moss was collected in the woods around New England and dried in the sun and kept in baskets, just like the cattail down.
How did they teach the children? What were some of the methods that they used?
Okay, there were no schools. Children did not go to school. They stayed with their parents. When they were very young, up until the time they were about 4 years old, the boys and girls stayed around the campground with the mother and all of the women. And they ran errands, and they got firewood, and they took messages back and forth. And they always watched, and they always listened. And then when they were old enough to start developing skills of their own, they were separated because the skills the boys had to learn and the skills the girls had were very different. So it was important to separate them. And the boys went with the men, and they watched and they learned, and they watched and they learned. And when the men felt they were ready to allow the boy to do a hunt, for instance, or cut down a tree by himself, then he was given the task. Girls, the same thing. Girls watched their parents. They watched women skin animals. They watched them prepare the cooking. They watched them make cattail mats. When the time was right for them to do it, then the girls did too. By the time they were 12 years old, they were pretty skilled. Both boys and girls could do a men's and women's job. And the bone, hoe, was another natural material. I almost forgot that. This hoe is made from the shoulder bone of a steer, actually, which would be the same size as the buffalo bone. In the plains, they would have used the buffalo bone to hoe their gardens, because that was a very, very good garden material, the garden tool that got sharp on the end. And they planted their corn, and they cultivated the gardens with that hoe. And in the Northeast, around here, they used the shoulder bone of a deer. It was a little tiny, just a little bit smaller, but it was made the same way as this. And this hoe works quite well.
Well, now that is some information on the general life of the tribes around here in Natick. But one of the most exciting things about living in Natick and learning some Natick history is knowing about some of the specific people at the early start of the town, and that is Jenny Lister's special interest. I think you were even interested in this before you knew you were going to be a Natick teacher.
Yes, I first heard about John Eliot when I was in college in a history class, but I didn't care much for history until I got to Natick. And I met John Eliot then, about a goodly number of years ago. And ever since then I've been researching and pondering and writing and teaching the children. And it's in the 3rd grade curriculum, which I love. And when we get right down to John Eliot, he was a human being that was, he was so alive with what he wanted to do for the Indians, and his whole lifespan was involved with them as well as with his own church in Roxbury. And he used to travel by horseback first to Nonantum, which is on, it's east in the southeast, south side of the Charles River near Watertown Mill. And this is where he first met the group of Indians who needed him and asked his help in learning to live among the Englishmen. He spent about 5 years talking to these people and teaching them the Christian faith, and he found that he wanted a place that was better for these people than among the Englishmen, and so he went to the general court with a few other people involved in all of this, of course. He went to the general court, and they found land out here at the Charles River in Natick. And it's often termed that Natick is the land of God's providing, and this is the way he felt about it. He brought his people, and there were about maybe 100 Indians. He brought them out here. He learned their language. He wrote a primer in their language. He translated the whole Bible into their language. This is besides having his own family and his own church. And once a week he would come out after they established the town and teach the Indians and preach to them under the Elliott Oak, which was at the location approximately where the Natick, South Natick Church is today.
And then what happened to John Eliot and his praying Indians?
They expanded. I mean, they moved around, and he sent missionaries out to other groups of Indians, and they established 14 praying towns. But unfortunately, the son of Massasoit, King Philip, decided that let's get rid of all the white men, and let's. So he tried to gather all the Indians in the eastern seaboard to get rid of them. But the Indians in Natick, the praying Indians and the other Christian Indians, they were caught between the white man and the Indian themselves. And they were sent to Deer Island because the Englishmen were afraid of them. They thought perhaps they would put them in different town areas, but every one they mentioned the town at that time said, no, let's send them off. And down the Charles River they went and off to the Boston Harbor. It was only through the kindness of Eliot and Daniel Gookin and others like them that they had food at all, but many of them starved because the land, actually the Deer Island belonged to one person, and he said, yes, you could inter them there, but they may not cut down wood or cut down, well, the trees, and there were other things, limitations given to them, yeah.
Oh.
So it was rough. However, one good side was that the English realized they needed the help of Indians to fight the way the Indians did, and they did get many of these Christian Indians who fought against their own people, and I think it was something like 600 fought, or 600, they actually killed 300 of their own as far as the records go. On another side of the story of the Natick Indians, however, and the Christian Indians, they had a chance to go to Harvard University, or Harvard College. They established a college at Harvard for the Indians, and said it was one little brick building. The one Indian who graduated, he died about 6 months afterwards. And he was a fine scholar, and there were others who had attended, but many of them couldn't stand their being inside for long periods of time, and they just were susceptible to, I guess the one died of consumption, as it was put. Yeah.
Well, those were things that happened a long time ago, but we have things that are happening right today in Natick where the Indians still have an impact. And teaching down in South Natick, Dottie, what are some of the things that happened recently?
Well, recently at lunchtime we went down to look in a hole, and in that hole what do we discover but bones that were part of something? Were they bones that you think perhaps came from the Natick Indians who were in this particular area? They were placed in a styrofoam cup, which really didn't have too much to do with the environment. I don't know where they are now, but I think just having this area and to see that even today, when you are building a road, you may be interfering with someone's burial ground. We need to be sensitive to the interests of others. you know, I grew up in New York State where we had the mighty Iroquois Nation, so that when I approach the study, and they've done such a brilliant job in 3rd grade using your material, so in 5th grade I approach it from a somewhat different point of view, wanting the youngsters to understand that it's not just an interesting group of people or it's sort of clever that we're studying them, but to look at the way man lived long ago, and that every group of people went through certain experiences. And after we've done some reading and research, I usually sort of brainstorm with them, have them list words that come to their minds when they think of Indian or Native people. And usually someplace on that list will be a word like savage, uncivilized. And then we use the Unabridged Dictionary and put down the meanings of savage and uncivilized. And then I talk to them about what anthropologists say, that a group of people are civilized when they have 10 basic needs, and then we point out what they are. And food, clothing, and shelter, providing some kind of transportation. Then, of course, you have to educate people. You have to be able to take care of the ill. And then you must have rules or some form of government. And then, of course, at the higher end, you have art and music, and then religion. And as we study each group, then we try to see if those things are present in that society, and they always are. And so we eliminate from our vocabulary, when we're thinking about Native Americans, the word savage or uncivilized. And I think that's important for boys and girls to understand.
As you're looking at the teaching of these cultures and the writing of books about these cultures, are there some specific needs that you feel should be addressed? I know what I feel is that we need a whole new series of books on tribes. This is one on the Apaches, which was written in 1951.
51.
And I think it's about time we took a new look. And with some of the modern art techniques, there are plenty of beautiful books on the Vikings and on the Greeks. They're constantly coming out with series after series, but they aren't. Do you have any idea why they're not?
Well, it's much safer to deal with dead cultures than that.
The Vikings don't have any,
They're
don't
not gonna
object
come
too
back
much.
and object to, right. But there has been a lot of research done, and particularly on a tribe like the Apache. And these books are now, there are a lot of books written for scholars, by scholars. It hasn't filtered down to children yet, but the information has been updated and it's accurate history. What we did to the Indians is now part of their history. They learn about it. And I think what Dorothy does in her class on eliminating stereotypes is very, very important. And that's why we need new children's books. We need to eliminate the stereotypes. And what television did with the wahoo-hoo and the headbands and things like this, that has to be eliminated. And unfortunately, some of it still exists in the old books.
There is sort of a new wave. This was in the 50s, and there were a lot of books done in the 70s that were a little bit more sensitive. I was looking at one called The Album of the American Indian, and it did have a lot of addressing of some of the problems.
Children's book?
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's good.
Yes.
There wasn't a big market sales for children's books about Native Americans for a very long time. It's beginning to come back now.
Like the environment.
Exactly.
They are sort of tied together. aren't they?
Oh, they're very tied together. And we know now that some of the brilliant speeches done by Native Americans are beginning to reappear. And the more we read they're poetic, they're beautiful. One of the reasons is they did not have a written language. Everything was oral. And so orally, what they presented was just beautiful. And it was because they concentrated so much on their oral presentations. And sometimes I forget about that. I think, how could these things sound so wonderful today? They wrote in 1800s beautiful, beautiful speeches about what we were doing to the environment that stand today.
There's I can't remember the name of the softcover book that we use in grade 5, where I think it's Coming to America or something to that effect. But they have the story of Red Jacket, and of course I was thrilled by that because he was an Iroquois. And there's a statue of him in Delaware Park, and he was just a brilliant orator. And I think for boys and girls to realize that at that time that one spoke well, one could sway groups of people. And I think they need to understand that, because the only thing they see is a limited speech pattern and the tom-toms or whatever, you know, in the background. And adults feel that way. I think we shouldn't imply only children, but I think with adults they have the idea that's all that is important, is just that one tiny segment of what they did.
Well, if you look back in Natick history, it's interesting that one of the printers of the Bible was an Indian, James the printer. And then you have John Sassman, who was very well versed in English, and he became, he helped John Eliot with the translation to some extent, but he also was secretary to King Philip. And it was during his time that he went back to the English, worked for them, and he tried to convert King Philip to Christianity, got into trouble, and ended up that King Philip had him murdered. But Sassman was very well educated.
And Sassaman is a famous name here in Natick.
That's
Natick
right.
High School, their yearbook is called.
Yes.
Yes. And right now you're working on a new book
Yes.
that deals with
Indian medicine, from the earth to beyond the sky. It's the way Native Americans used herbs for cures and talked to the spirits, pleaded with the spirits. They felt that they were one with the earth. They were no more important than any other living creature, non-living creature. Everyone had a spirit that had to be dealt with and thanked, and they appreciated. They appreciated their position in the environment, and they appreciated an animal that gave themselves to feed a human. And I'm learning all of this as I'm researching about
Well, this
medicine.
is fascinating, and the children are going to benefit from all three approaches. Thank you very much for
Thank
coming
you.
today.